Hello and welcome to this brief session. My name is Mark Stringer and I am a part-time PhD student in the Department of Organisational Psychology at Birkbeck, and I'm also a lecturer and a Programme Director in the Department of Psychology at Birkbeck. So it gives me great pleasure to have some time to take you through what I have been researching and looking at in the realms of employee engagement over the course of my time in my PhD. And this, the title of this project is What You Want From Me, Interpreting the Discourses of Fancy, Jouissance, Desire and Lack in Employee Engagement. The question of what do you want from me it will become more apparent as we work it through it, but this is a project which I have undertaken following an interest in the early development of employee engagement when I was back working in a non-academic role, and the introduction of employee engagement survey probably was one of the first in the public sector back in the early and late 2000s, and it's something that I had been asked to manage and to utilise. And it struck me as something really interesting within what was being asked and looked at and understood as being knowledge in terms of the realms of employee engagement. So what I will be doing on this session is to firstly just take you through what employee engagement is, or what the current understanding in the field of it is, both from academic and practitioner point of view. I'm then going to be taking you through the kind of the lenses that I've been using, which have been a Lacanian psychoanalytic lens, and sort of discuss very briefly why this approach has been taken. Then I'm going to kind of take you through a little bit more about the idea of using Lacan in looking at employee engagement, some reflections on analysis and myself as a researcher, and then to kind of cover off some of the aims of the study itself, then a summary. So if we plunge headlong into what is employee engagement, and that is a question, if I'm honest, that I still struggle with, and as do both the kind of theoretical and practitioner aspects of it. But for me, the concept of employee engagement has become an increasing focus within organisations over the last 15 years. Its own historical trajectory and use within organisations can be set against the backdrop and context from the beginning of the 21st century. Looking back over the last 20 years, a position is taken in this research that provides a space for employee engagement to be interpreted as an ideological organisational response to the development and underscoring of precarious working conditions, the war on talent, a technocratic threat from the development of AI, and the debilitating effects of 4 decades of neoliberalism and free market economies. This has led to both an erosion of the planet's resources and the provision of fertile spaces for financial catastrophes, and, as we have seen in the last 18 months, global pandemics, alongside which has seen a rise in the levels of anxiety and mental health issues globally in and out of work. However, there remains a distinct existential crisis and the lack of agreement of what employee engagement actually is, and across the academic practitioner divide, as I said. And although one could argue that this lack plays a part in its success, and is thus both maintained and encouraged, when we talk about the idea of fantasy here, and certainly from a Lacanian point of view, employee engagement kind of reproduces this kind of fantasy. That said, a consensus of thought does appear to circle around a leitmotif of employee engagement being a process which is a win-win for both an organisation and its workers. However, reflecting critically on its basis terms and the context highlighted above, employee engagement perhaps appears to be an avenue to extract more in terms of performance and loyalty, so the organisational demands from the worker, whilst for the worker it promises a more meaningful and fulfilling work experience, so therefore fulfilling an employee's needs within precarious and anxiety-inducing economic and employment contexts. Given this, the challenge presented here then is towards the a priori acceptance within the field of employee engagement as this being both a win-win and a benevolent state of affairs within organisational life. Rather than trying to measure, predict or validate, how do those working within UK organisations that publicly aspire to and actively support a discourse of employee engagement cope with these demands? More specifically, in using a Lacanian psychoanalytical perspective, with the use of the theories of fantasy, lack, desire and jouissance, the modest aim of my research is to provide a contribution to the understanding of employee engagement that does not reduce the individual to a number. Using the psychoanalytic framework of Lacan provides the tools to problematize employee engagement as an empty signifier, and the effect upon the subject's libidinal economy in responding to organisational demands for efforts to be seen to increase their own engagement. So that's all very well. But why is psychoanalysis? Why is this a useful tool? I'd counter that and respond to that and saying, well, psychoanalysis can offer a way for us to outline patterns of desire in which subjects become stuck. That is, to go some way in explaining individuals' investments in certain positions despite evidence of their irrationality. Much of the previous academic research on employee engagement has in the main viewed the idea of employee engagement from a unitarist, normative and quantitative research-based paradigm. Broadly, this research highlights mutuality and benevolence for both parties. Yet, is this the full story? Is employee engagement really a win-win? Do all employees really want to be engaged? And what does this even mean? Employee engagement is the new incarnation of a particular type of motivational relationship. Yet, is what we want, what we need, always that clear, always known to us, or even knowable? In order to provide a different interpretation, I have drawn upon Lacanian concepts of fantasy, lack, desire and jouissance. These provide a set of tools to suggest that the feelings of loss, lack and desire individuals are being commodified via employee engagement. This is being undertaken via organisational attempts to create environments in which the worker, in workplaces that are now more precarious and fragile than ever, having to unleash their unconscious energies in order to continue running to stand still, with the notion of discretionary effort and the increased levels of productivity falling under the employee engagement headline. I propose here that the engagement construct is being over-psychologized in theoretical terms. Why do I use this term? Because it individualizes the benefit, because it treats everything as a set of variables, thereby losing the human subject and the struggles faced in responding to the demands made by the organisation. There is an opportunity to view engagement askew, to problematise the ubiquity of it as a concept, and to provide a contrasting view in highlighting a possible darker side to the process. Psychoanalytic concepts can help us achieve this aim. My focus is on utilising these key Lacanian concepts in relation to exploring engagement. For Lacan, fantasy is a protective function of defence, a way in which a subject is able to defend itself from the lack of the other here being seen as the organisation. The question of what does the other want from me being unconsciously asked by the subject of the organisation. Jouissance coming not from an achievement of a hoped-for object, but from the relentless pursuit of this desire, and desire itself defined in the sense of a continual deferral, perpetuating itself in a never-ending fashion, an irreducible kernel that is constantly sought but unfailingly never found. And lack, the object of desire being essentially an object desired by someone or something else here, the organisation when it talks and places, symbolises engagement. Desire is not a relation to an object but a relation to a lack, so a lack in the organisation in terms of it needing and requiring a greater level of engagement from the worker. And here, this lack, the desire to fill it by whatever it takes, whilst defending oneself against what thus amounts to an unachievable fantasy, stands the signifier of employee engagement. Use of Lacanian psychoanalysis has become instrumental in pointing out the complex interrelations between subjectivity, language, meaning and enjoyment. Lacan's work has been influential not only in psychoanalytic practice, but also in many disciplines in the social sciences, in which it has served to point out the prevalent symptoms of subjectivity enmeshed in capitalist society. Such use of psychoanalysis is not aimed at a pathological subject, i.e. the worker, but at the pathology of the system in which a subject comes into being. So here, the workplace. I quote here from a paper from Bignor and Lifuge in 2010, a really interesting paper looking at the world of chefs and the fire services. Lacan suggests that the focal point is what is missing. and thereby allowing taken for granted presumptions to be challenged and new readings made. And throughout this, my approach has been that I'm not going to be aiming to unearth a brand new truth or the truth around employee engagement, but to offer up a different interpretation of employee engagement. Lacan's work therefore kind of focuses on speech, on how we think we communicate within what he termed the symbolic order, that we are speaking subjects spoken through by language. We can experience this in differing ways. For example, we can sometimes may struggle to find the right words, or perhaps we may find ourselves in the grip of language itself and find ourselves saying too much, that feeling that language is overwriting us. Throughout the entire project, there is a need to remind ourselves and myself that Lacan was first and foremost a clinician. His work, to develop from that of Freud, Hegel, Saussure, Levi-Strauss and Spinoza, was based on a large amount of work dealing with clinical subjects. In taking Lacan outside of the clinic, we need to be wary of assumptions and are sympathetic to its uses utilised inside it. The idea of a Lacanian subject of us has a different connotation to what a non-Lacanian reading of what us as a human being is a subject means. A Lacanian subject is created in and through language. The unconscious is expressed via this language. The unconscious is not an inaccessible container within each of us. It is in fact across all of us as speaking beings. Hence the well-used Lacanian term, the unconscious, is structured as a language. This is a debt to the use of Saussurean structural linguistics and the structural anthropology of Levi-Strauss. Thus the term structuralism, albeit Lacan never recognised himself as either a structuralist, post-structuralist. In turning to Lacan's notion of jouissance, his concept is linked to increased tension and the building up of desire. In one way, we can view this as transgressing Freud's pleasure principle, going beyond it, attaining a sense of enjoyment that you know that you shouldn't. For example, the feeling of Schadenfreude, gaining pleasure from another's misfortune, or indeed watching those homemade video shows where someone gets hurt whilst goofing around. You know you shouldn't enjoy it, but there's a sense that you really do. You are unsure why, and you cannot put your finger on it. Time for analysis, maybe. Jouissance, then, in this view, comes not from an achievement of a hoped-for object, but from the relentless pursuit of it, hence the idea of desire. For the idea of desire, then, and engagement, as proposed by Lacan, desire appears at the margin where demand is torn from need. And into that margin I work with the notion of employee engagement. The structure of desire for a subject is such that any individual empirical object will fail to satisfy it. It is the function of fantasy to substitute for the unknowable real desire. Since we cannot know what the other wants, all we can do is fantasize about being the object of their desire. For example, the illusion of recognition when we look into a mirror. What we see is what we believe to us, but this is an imaginary construction of the ego. This desire for recognition does not dissipate and therefore forms part of what many of us crave in our lives, including our work, recognition from the other. It is here that engagement is placed as a fantasy, a hoped-for recognition by the subject from the other, to be loved in a way, to become whole, to fill a lack that resides in the other. And this lack is communicated at work by messages, communications, posters, meetings, reports, surveys, performance management process, stories, narratives. A multitude of voices declaring engagement is what is desired. So desire is essentially a desire for recognition from the other. And that desire is for the thing that we suppose the other desires, which is to say the thing the other lacks. Desire can then be considered as which answers the unconscious question that is asked of the individual and the subject: what is it that you want from me? What I've got here then is just a couple of examples of some of the fragments of text from the myriad of interviews and experiences and site visits that I've undertaken throughout the research process. And the first couple will be around the idea of lack and desire, and the third one will be around that of fantasy and jouissance. So the first kind of, and I've highlighted some keywords here, and my notes below are just kind of an example of some of my thoughts in terms of how this is being interpreted from a Lacanian point of view. So for this participant, the idea here is, and here's a quote: "What I find that I need to be needed. I always have this sort of thing. I need to be the saviour. I need to come in and fix the problem, and I need people to be aware that I can fix that problem. And in so many ways, being fully engaged at work with this organisation delivers that for me. I realise that this is something which is trying to fill a gap in me as a person, but at a cost." And my notes here and the thinking is that there's some key elements which are interesting to look at, which is the idea of a thing, or das Ding, as Freud highlighted. So the thing that is the object of desire, which can never be attained. The idea of saviour, even within and without its kind of religious or theological context. There's a kind of the idea of saviour in Savoy, and not too far away in French Savoy to know is interesting in terms of the kind of the etymology and of the words there. The idea of the big other, wanting to fill out that gap. The point of fixing, so the point de capiton is an idea and theory in a signifying point which fixes sense in language. So there's the point thing here of trying to fix that problem, and there's certainly an idea of recognition, but at what cost is being vocalised by the individual in this this fragment. Another one, I'll just read it out. But at the same time, you're having this other side of you that's saying, I'm kind of pissed off and disengaged with it, and the organisation still wants me to asking me to be engaged. So I think if you've been working for an organisation for a long time, you're bound to have this kind of Jekyll and Hyde. You know, there's a split personality on how you feel about the organisation. And what is interesting here is this idea of the split ideal ego from a Lacanian point of view, the idea of when we look into the mirror and we see what we think is a whole person looking back at us, but actually that's an alienated image. We are split in that point. What we see is not reality. It's what we make up as our ideal ego, what we think we look like and our whole. There's a sense of being a kind of fantasy defence, that we're being pissed off, this individual's being pissed off. And why the term pissing? From a metaphorical point of view, that's interesting as well. What does that mean in terms of the notion of what that may mean for the individual, in maybe as a resistance to the idea of engagement for them? The idea of maybe of transgression in doing that. But there's all the kind of recognition of being engaged, and this idea of Jekyll and Hyde, the monstrous other, is something which is really interesting too when we think about the idea of bringing bringing one's whole self to work. From a fantasy and Joasson's point then, another quote: "So I think, when you feel that, like that, fairly well behaved, you get into that virtuous circle. I think, when you get more engaged where it doesn't feel like work so much, I think you feel better able to solve problems, you feel more committed. And if you have to do something for work in your leisure time, it doesn't feel so much like an imposition on your leisure time so much. It's part of what you do, And what's interesting here is there's kind of metaphorical speech, so you're getting into that virtuous circle. So the virtuous circle is a container, and within that circle there's a kind of repetition that takes place. That circle as a whole, there's a kind of topological idea to that too. So that whole, does that need filling via solving problems? So there's that coming through as a theme, to solve and to fix. And the idea of the part of what you do, so it's that part of us filling in a lack and a fantasy of wholeness, and there's key terms there of imposition and leisure time too, in terms of the crossing the boundaries or the blurring of what is required and when it's required, in terms of being engaged or displaying behaviours, as it says here, fairly well behaved, in terms of employee engagement. So they're kind of three brief but hopefully illuminating fragments from the work so far, which is it gives a sense of an idea of loss, of fragmentation, of identity, a lack of completeness, perpetual desire to become whole, and on being recognised by another to mitigate a lack in relation to the idea of engagement. But throughout all of this, who am I as a researcher? Who am I as someone who is utilising these tools and who has taken on this task? So for me, the idea is to reflect on analysis itself. And as that image there from a religious text from the Middle East shows, we have images and we have stories, but those stories sometimes do break outside of the boundaries that are set around them. And that is one of the kind of motivating factors for me for this piece of research. So just as analysts should resist imposing their interpretation on their kind of analysand's statements when they're in the clinical situation, researchers, scholars, academics are wishing to apply psychoanalytic concepts should withstand their temptation of delivering their conclusions from a position of authority, of being in the know. So this idea of not knowing has been very key to this piece of research, that myself as a researcher not being the person who is able to know everything, actually coming from a perspective of not knowing. So one of the consequences of engaging with the psychoanalytic ideas is having to relinquish a sense of certainty in one's ability to access fully the forces governing subjectivities. And in using a Lacanian discourse analytical method to interpret the empirical material, I've needed to recognise that any attempt will inevitably fail to provide a complete picture. So reflexive activity and the questioning of the position of the subject supposed to know, me as the researcher, has been a key consideration throughout this project. Alongside this is the acknowledgement that meanings will never become final, but locating them is a necessary decision when I'm working through the material. It involves letting the differences multiply in terms of my views on that material. Within all of this, when we talk about the idea of Lacan, and when I'm actually meeting and have been talking to people, it's always good to understand also the idea of communication. And that communication is always a failure, and the not knowing angle of that. And there's a really lovely quote from the paper from Verhaeghe in 1995, which neatly sums up a lot, I think, for me in terms of this process. Lacan starts from the assumption that communication is always a failure. Moreover, that it has to be a failure, and that's the reason why we keep on talking. If we understood each other, we would all remain silent. Luckily enough, we don't understand each other, so we have to speak to one another. So the aims of the study have been around the kind of use of the Lacanian tools as a psychoanalytical approach in response to the kind of normative, unitarist and positivistic view of employee engagement previously. The analysis and interpretation of the material via using Lacanian inflected discourse analysis is something that I've been a privilege to do and to kind of work through and to learn and to deliver. The idea of unearthing a kind of more transparent and an ethical view on employee engagement has been a key part to this as well, and that ties in nicely also to the kind of the Lacanian ethics, which is around aiming to try and speak a truth for an individual, and that's something which has been an important part to me. And the impact and practice is not just it comes to a point where you hand in this huge chunk of work and that's the output and you get a few papers from it. Far from it. I think the impact and practice for me has been on how I have interacted with my participants. It's about how this has impacted and has filtered through into my teaching, into my supervision, into my own relation with myself and with my colleagues and with students and friends. So it's been the impact and practice for me has been a long journey, and that the outputs necessarily from the academic side of it will take place. However, they are not the be-all and end-all. So to finish up, I just want to kind of summarise and say that we have been looking at the idea of engagement within organisational settings, and within the pathology of an organisational system. I think it's here that the psychoanalytic lens of my research aims to utilise its ability to disrupt kind of the ideological of the intuitive, natural and the commonplace. To promote discussions on the ethical transparency of an interpretation of engagement as a win-win fantasy, along with the unchallenged discourse of equitability within engagement. And lastly, to provide a different view on the demands being made on a subject's unconscious desire in the performative act of being engaged. So I do hope you've enjoyed that very brief kind of run through my research. The last slide has got the kind of references which I've used in this piece, and if you are interested in kind of talking about this or further in terms of the research, then I'd be more than happy to chat to you. My contact email at Birkbeck is m.stringer@bbk.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. Hopefully this has created some interest in your mind, and yeah, thank you very much for watching. Do take care.